Good evening, thanks for coming. I probably don't need to be behind that. I wanted to talk to you tonight, as Joshua said, about the future, and I want you to kind of take yourselves out of the space of today and tomorrow and American politics and your current life and think about big picture. When I say big picture, I mean really big picture. I want you to think about the future of civilization and humanity, where we've come from, where we're going to. And that requires us to sort of have a slightly different mindset, if you like, than we would normally have, in our day-to-day lives. I want to tell you a bit about where I've come from before I explain where I've got to, because the book is really resulting from 35 years of focus in this area. I've spent a long time, first of all, as an activist on human rights and social change issues, from anti-apartheid and struggles in East Timor and various places as a human rights socially focused activist from the age of 15, 16 onwards. And then moved through anti-nuclear weapons issues. I joined the military at one stage, and that's sort of not part of tonight's presentation, but a funny story perhaps for later, when I was an anti-nuclear activist while I was serving in the Australian military, which is fairly unusual for members of the Australian military, as you can imagine. Went on from there to become a full-time anti-nuclear weapons activist, went into the environmental area, became head of Greenpeace in Australia, and then head of Greenpeace worldwide, based in Amsterdam. And then, so that was sort of the conclusion of 15, 17 years or so of environmental and social activism. And then I decided to put my mind to business, still as an activist in my view, but owning a company and trying to see if you really could drive change from within the corporate sector, from deep inside the corporate sector. And, fairly successfully so, built up a company doing strategy consulting to major corporates, mostly here in the US, people like DuPont and Ford, and globally with BHP Billiton, Diageo, Anglo American, a range of, chemical, automotive, insurance, banking, a range of different businesses. Also in that time frame, for my own another company doing energy efficiency in the home. So really focused on entrepreneurship and, is that the part of the solution towards where we need to get to? Towards the end of that process, so we're kind of 30 odd years into the process at this stage, towards the end of that I took 3 months off on sabbatical and sat at home, played with my kids, didn't do very much at all for a while, and reflected deeply on progress, or lack thereof. And this was 2005, and what came to me really clearly at that point, which led to the book and led to the things I want to tell you tonight, what came to me at that time was that we've come to the end of the process of what I called then the scream. And I wrote a letter called Scream, Crash, Boom to my friends, which talked about the scream being the kind of the call for action on the environment. The 50 years since Rachel Carson, all the way through, of people saying, wake up, we have a crisis, wake up, we've got a problem. So it was kind of the alarm being called. And what seemed to me that we were heading towards, this is, as I said, 5, 6 years ago, was the crash. Right, was the point where it was now inevitable to me at that stage, given the lack of response, that we were going to face quite a major disruption in society, and that was clearly coming. And then we would respond, and I'll come back to that shortly. A few years after that, I wrote a letter called Scream, Crash, Boom, called The Great Disruption, which was the second version of that. The Great Disruption being, of course, the title of the book. And that was saying that what was clear in early 2008, which hadn't been clear until then. Up until then, it was sort of my instinct and theory. In 2008, what was very, very clear was that we were then seeing the impacts, right? When this is before the financial crisis, we were seeing oil prices going up to record levels. We were seeing food prices going up to record levels. We were seeing the Arctic, ice cap melting. We were seeing incredibly significant changes in the ecosystem, as well as, shortages of resources and the complexity of the food system, which I think is a great way of bringing together all the things that we talk about in sustainability, of increasing demand and economic growth, of climate impacts, of soil degradation and so on. So food to me has always been the kind of symbolic point where this all comes together. So what we saw in 2008, before the financial crisis, and which I then wrote about, was that we had come to the end of economic growth, right? And what was happening was, in fact, what I use as the opening line of the book, is the earth is full. Now, the earth is full is not just a rhetorical line. It certainly is, I think, a very good rhetorical line. I didn't think of it, but I used it. But it's a physical, chemical, biological statement, right? And this is really important because I'm not arguing in the book that we need to change, right, to prevent this crisis from happening. What I'm saying is we've come to the end of the model. that this model is now fundamentally broken, right? And we cannot continue from this point on in any meaningful way, and the future is defined by the consequences of the Earth being full. Now, that's a big call. It's a particularly big call to say that economic growth is finished, because economic growth, of course, is the only idea we've had for quite a long time for most things. It's the way we're supposed to fix poverty, get enough capital to invest in technologies to solve our problems, keep people employed, keep society stable, deal with poverty and rich countries and their interaction, deal with poverty internally. It's all about the pie getting bigger, right, and the share of the pie changing for people internally. The great American dream, is the idea that we can tolerate people being very rich, because one day we might be very rich or our kids might be very rich. And so that idea is all predicated on this fundamental idea that the pie keeps on getting bigger. And the essence of the book is saying, well, guess what? The pie's full, right? And the Earth is full. And what that means is that there are now consequences which we have to face up to in terms of how we go forward. So I'm going to come back to this issue of the Earth being full and economic growth being finished, but let me just focus on the basic science behind that, because this is really the critical argument I'm putting in the book. The critical argument is that whichever way we measure it, whether we look at the global footprint networks work, for example, on measuring the economy in terms of land area needed, whether we look at the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, a survey of 2,000 scientists work in this area to assess what ecosystem services humanity needs from the environment and how those supply of services is going. Whether you look at the work done with the Stockholm Resilience Centre, for example, on planetary boundaries. Whenever anyone, any significant group of scientists, looks at the peer-reviewed science on the things that humanity's economy needs from the environment, their conclusion is we're using it unsustainably. Now, that's also, I think, needs a bit of definition, because unsustainably has sort of become this philosophical view that sustainable things are nice and unsustainable things aren't nice, right? And it's true, but it's also true that when something is not sustainable, it will stop. Right? So this is not kind of a philosophical statement, it's a statement of physics. So if something is not sustainable, it won't keep on going. And in that case, what this means is that the model which we're using to develop humanity and the Earth and our place within it is not sustainable, it will therefore stop. And that's the essence of my argument, if you like, is that we've reached the end of that process. So to dig a bit deeper into the science around that, let's look at the Global Footprint Network. It's a very credible group of scientists globally who look at all the impacts of human society on the environment in terms of land area needed. So they translate into global hectares. How many hectares do we have? How many hectares do we need? And I emphasise here the analysis is not about, is the environment a nice place? It's not about how many polar bears there are or the state of the global ecosystem, right? All of which many of us would argue is actually very important, possibly more important. This work is not about that. This work is about what do we need as a human economy, right? What does our economy depend upon to have that level of activity? And the answer is we need about 1.5 planets, right? We need about 1.5 times as many global hectares of available land as there is to use them in a sustainable way to keep this economy going. Now, this is a very low-tech presentation. This is my PowerPoint slide presentation. So, very, very eco-efficient. This is the Earth, right? It's round and it's about this big, right? This is the economy. It's also round and it's bigger. Now, of course, that's not physically possible because the Earth won't expand to suit us. Therefore, we're squeezing the economy, right, into the Earth. Now, what that means is we're pushing against the edges of that, and the harder we push, the tighter it gets, and it can't go beyond it. So it just gets tighter and tighter. And so, of course, many systems are designed to tolerate being operated past their capacity a bit, right? And so we do that. And people often say to me, well, if we're operating past capacity, how do we do that? Why aren't we falling apart completely? And the answer, of course, is it's like living on your credit card, right? As all of us have done at various times and, silly parts of our life, live beyond our means, right? And life, as it does now in society, in humanity, feels pretty good. Right? Because you're using your credit card to buy the stuff that you need, to go out to dinner, to buy your gadgets, whatever you're doing that you find entertaining, you're doing that. And life doesn't feel as though you're living beyond your means. Life actually feels really good, right, until the bill comes in. And when the bill comes in, of course, if you've got enough credit cards and enough bill, then you lose the house. And that's where we are, is that the credit card bill is coming due and we're in danger of losing the big house as a result. So It's absolutely possible to operate past capacity for a sustained period of time, and we have been. Right? Since the late 80s, in fact, we've been operating past 1 Earth, moving steadily towards where we are now, which is 1.5 Earths. And by the way, that is a significant problem. In a technical sense, this is an Australian sort of scientific term, it's called a very big problem. And I call a chapter in the book a very big problem because I have a lot of Australian readers, so I need to say it pretty straightforward. And the very big problem is about 150% of capacity, right? And that's a very big problem, but it's a quite manageable problem because actually we waste so much, right? And we do so many things, in a very silly way that we can get from 1.5 down to 1 with, a bit of effort. I'm not saying it's kind of easy, but we can certainly do that, and it would be far from impossible. So we can solve a very big problem. So when you hear people say, look, we're ingenious, we're humanity, we're smart, we have technology, we can change things, we can fix things, that probably is true to go from 1.5 to 1. The trouble is we've only just begun at 1.5, right? And we plan to go from 1.5 Earths to around 2 Earths by about 2030. And we plan to go from there to about 3 or 4 Earths by 2050, right? Because that is the nature of exponential economic growth, is that the more you have, the bigger it gets, that rate of growth becomes exponential, right? And there are a lot of people in the world who have been suffering a very severe psychological delusion, which is that you can have infinite growth on a finite planet, right? And clearly you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet because eventually it gets too big for the planet. And that's my argument, is that that's where we are now. So just think about very big problem, right? Think about 1.5 times the Earth, and then think about that growing at 300 or 400% more, right, to get to 2050. Now, the good news in that is that that's not going to happen, right? The good news is that it's not possible to have an economy 3 or 4 times as big as the planet. The good news is that there aren't enough resources to feed that economy, therefore it's not going to happen. That's sort of good news, but it's sort of bad news. Now, the reason it's bad news, of course, is because we only have one idea for everything, and it's called economic growth. And if economic growth is not possible, then going beyond where we are today is not possible. Therefore, the system we depend upon for virtually everything we assume about life going forward is fundamentally broken. Then we have a very, very big problem, right? Which is bigger than a very big problem, by the way, in case that wasn't clear. So, when we think this through, that this is going to be a problem, then the crisis is coming. Now, and people say, what does that look like? What does that feel like when you go to 1.5 or 2? When growth stops and the system starts fighting back, what does that feel like? And I say it actually feels like 2011, actually. Just with a lot less denial, right, and a bit more action, right? Action as in problems, not as in action in response to it. And what it feels like is, as resources get constrained, we have to work harder to get them. So we dig oil wells deeper, right, to get to the oil. What it looks like is that land becomes incredibly valuable, and therefore people get desperate for food and do things, importantly, to get more food. So, for example, in the last, since the 2008 food crisis, we have a few countries, China, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, a few others, have gone around the world buying up farmland, right? And in fact, in recent years, those 3 or 4 countries have bought an area of farmland equivalent to half all the arable land in China, right? Because they want food, which is a completely rational, reasonable thing for humans to do, especially if you're rich, which those countries are. So they simply go to Africa, they go to various places, Pakistan, etc., and they say, we'll have your land, please, and we'll invest in your country. So the countries say, yeah, that's great, we love investment, that's good for jobs, that's good for growth, come and buy our land. And then, by the way, later on we'll have a conversation about who gets the food, right? So that is what it looks like when the earth gets full, is people start scrambling for resources, right? And they pay differently for different resources and things become more valuable. My favourite sort of story in this area at the moment is about the China Jinhu Mining Company, who changed its name last year to the New Zealand Natural Dairy Company, right? Get that? From the Jinhu Mining Company to the New Zealand Natural Dairy Company, and of course they went to New Zealand and started trying to buy up dairy farms, because they worked out that in this economy we're coming to, getting land, getting food, especially in clean, green, grazing country in New Zealand, right, is suddenly a really good place to get clean food from, to bring back into China where they're demanding clean food, because theirs, of course, is not so clean. right? So that whole grasp and desperate grab for resources, of course, is what we're seeing, what we'll be seeing a lot more of. So when that crisis hits, when that crisis is understood, I should say, because I think it's hitting now, when that crisis is understood, then we are going to respond, right? And we'll come to that shortly about the response. But let's be clear that even though it's going to be very clear that, you know, we are very, very addicted to growth, right? And when you're addicted to something, the level of denial and the level of ignorance about all the evidence around you gets more and more extreme, right? So 2008 to me was when this happened. You know, 2008 was when we hit the limits in terms of growth, and we started seeing resource prices spiking, oil prices spiking, ecological breakdown accelerating beyond anything that had been forecast, and yet we said it was a credit crisis, right? And it wasn't a credit crisis. There was a credit crisis because if you keep on borrowing money to try and make a machine work inside constrained limits because it's getting harder and harder, it costs a lot of money, right? And at this stage, we've kind of used up our kids' credit cards, so we stole our grandkids' credit cards and used that money to try and get the thing going again. But because of that denial, we'll keep on doing that, right? And it's really important to understand that what I'm saying is, even though the crisis is going to get more and more extreme, we are going to respond, right? But we're not going to respond yet because we're going to wait until this gets unbearable, impossible, and so clear that then we're going to have to respond to it. And in that time frame, it's going to get a bit unpleasant as we go through that cycle. Now, there is a point in the book, and I say this throughout the book as I'm taking the reader down and down and down and down, as I'm taking you down and down and down and down, that stay with me here. We are getting to the bottom at some point and coming up again. Not yet, but we will get there, so stay with me. We have to go down further because we have to recognise, and this in many ways was the main reason for writing the book, is that I think we're in denial. Even those of us who are, by definition, this audience tonight, probably sympathetic to the issues, right, are actually in denial. And the denial that we're in is that it's too late to prevent a major crisis. It's not too late to do things, and I'll come back to that, but it's too late to prevent a major crisis. And that is a really serious problem, right? Is that it means that we're thinking, and our politics and our activism and our social change and our advocacy is based around the idea that we must act before it's too late. And my point is that it's not too late in a literal sense, but it is too late to prevent there being significant breakdown of society, significant consequences in terms of the economy and the global ecosystem, right? And that's going to translate into some very unpleasant times, right? And we're going to have to get ready for that and move through that. Now, that is a unpleasant thing. That's the only way to kind of describe it, really, is that if you're an environmentalist who spent 35 years campaigning against this point from occurring, then when it arrives, that's not much fun, actually. That's actually just sad, right? Because what it means is there are consequences to what we've done, which will now bear the impact of, and we have to face up to that and get ready to move through that. Now, there is a belief, if you like, in the environmental community that once we get to that point, it's too late. And this is where, by the way, we're kind of approaching the bottom of the roller coaster here. Is there a point where it's too late? Technically, possibly, yes. But if you look at the evidence of history, what tends to happen is we wait until we're there, right, and then we respond, right? And the crisis that we're facing, that I would argue, is actually the best thing that's happened to us for a long time, right? Because a crisis is going to be so dramatic and so extreme and so about something that matters to us, i.e. the economy, that we are going to respond, right? And when we do respond, the response is going to be, I think, breathtaking and spectacular. Now, if you look at history, and I always struggle to find things that are big enough to compare it to, and where I always get to is World War II. Right? World War II is important to me for a bunch of reasons. One is that I think Winston Churchill is the best orator on climate change ever. Right? He didn't know it was about climate change, but it really was primarily about climate change. Because he said things like, don't ask what is our best, ask what is necessary. Right? So there's a whole bunch of ideas in there which are very, very deep, because we're currently thinking about what's the best we can do. What's the possibilities in terms of market change and policy? What's the best that we can do? And let's be realistic about what's achievable, right? And being realistic when civilization is at threat, right? And the alternative of getting this wrong is the collapse of civilization. I don't want to be realistic, Right? I want to do what's necessary to prevent that from happening. So I think Churchill is actually a very, that framing of the issue is right. So when the crisis hits, what we're going to do is respond. Right? And we are, let's be really clear, we are incredibly good in a crisis. So when you think about all the people who argue, look, it'll be okay, humanity is great, we can do amazing technology, we're going to fix this, markets will respond, government will intervene, we'll do amazing things. They're all true, but only when it's a short-term crisis. Right? They're not true in terms of preventing it. They are true in terms of how we respond to it. And if you look at the history of a whole range of issues, in terms of humanity, whether it be personal health crisis, whether it be a corporate crisis, a government crisis in a country, or a threat like war, we tend to go through this pattern of behaviour of denial, followed by crisis, followed by response. Right? And World War II, again, I think, has the best examples of this, because even though we look back at history and we think, okay, well, that was sort of inevitable, wasn't it? I mean, Hitler was obviously a threat. He invaded Poland. The UK responded. That was kind of obvious that they would then respond because he invaded Poland. Well, it's actually the third country he invaded, right? And it was actually going on for a long time at that point, right? And why Poland rather than France? Why did that trigger the response? And what was it like at the time? Actually, it wasn't obvious at the time either. And there was actually a huge debate inside the UK in all these years leading up to it. And Winston Churchill, who was in the end a great wartime leader, was at that time, before the war, discredited, ridiculed, pilloried as a scaremonger, as a militarist, as, overstating the threat. It wasn't that bad. People wouldn't respond. People wouldn't care. We couldn't organise that well anyway. It was too expensive. It sounds like all the arguments we use now. Right? And it was all the arguments we use now, because that's what we do. Right? We have this debate about how bad it is, it's not that bad, etc., as we are today. So the point is, it's important to remember that, because it wasn't obvious. Right? And it wasn't clear. It wasn't like, binary switch, invade Poland, we go to war. I have to check this out to make sure this is accurate, but someone told me at a talk the other day that there was a cabinet debate for 10 days, right, in the UK about going to war at that point, because there were still people who said it wasn't that bad. Who cares about Poland anyway? They didn't really say that. That's just what I thought. Who cares about Poland? I'm sure they did say that inside the cabinet room, but it wouldn't have been recorded. And, let them have France as long as they don't come here. In fact, let's just give in. In fact, let's negotiate a surrender now while we can, while we still have some reason to. Let them have Europe. That was the debate that was happening. Right? So it wasn't inevitable. Right? It wasn't definite. It was actually a furious, conflicting debate with denial, avoidance, and all the same things that we see today. Right? So it is, again, very normal in terms of human behaviour. But when we then responded, right, when Churchill got his way, right, and when he became the person in charge, then he became a great wartime leader, and suddenly amazing things happened, because the context had changed. So all the things that seemed impossible, women going to work in factories, redirecting the entire industrial economy towards the war effort, suddenly raising in just mind-bogglingly large amounts of money, right, in a country that allegedly couldn't afford it, by doing bonds, campaigns to reduce consumerism, to free up financial and physical resources for the war effort. And likewise, this is same here in the US, just amazing changes. So within 4 days of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, right, the US government banned the sale of automobiles, right, by the production of automobiles by car companies. Compare that to the debate today on climate change. Right? So we're absolutely capable of that. And it wasn't like that was obvious at the time. That was a huge debate at the time too. The US auto industry had sought and got assurances from the US government that that wasn't going to happen before Pearl Harbor. Well, we would never do that. Right? Rest easy, we're not going to suddenly come in and take over your companies. That would be, political risk, unacceptable in the market, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, sorry, we were joking about that. We're doing it now. Right? So that capacity to respond is about the context, and when the context changes and we get a sense of crisis, then we will respond in that way, and we're very capable of doing so. And remember here, the crisis, this is a serious crisis. I mean, this is not about being invaded. This is about the end of civilization as we know it. This is about the potential for the collapse of humanity, right? So there is nothing bigger in terms of potential, right? And of course we know that today, and the question is, well, why aren't we responding? Because we're in denial about that. Right, and once we do go out of denial and go into that mode, it will be a sudden flip, right, when we change, and we'll come back to a bit about why that might occur. But if you're not sure about that, just think about all the examples when we have responded in a crisis. When you have personally, when people around you have, when companies have been involved have, with governments have, and when nations have. It is a very consistent pattern of behaviour. So then the issue becomes, well, can we still do it? Is there, because in the science debate there is a great lot of research. Is it too late? When's too late? Are there runaway impacts? How much can we control this anyway? So there is a belief by many people that there is a point where it's too late to respond, that the impacts, because of the lags in the climate system, are overwhelming and we can't then respond. Let me just address that issue. What I did for that issue, and it's the one area, unlike most of this book, which is really just a summary of many, many people's thinking over 50 years, right, into a sort of synthesised analysis of what I think is happening. This was actually original research done with a fellow called Jürgen Randers, who was one of the authors of the Club of Rome Limits to Growth report in 1972. So I like him because he makes me look like a newcomer in the issue. And he's been doing this for a very long time. And he and I sat down, we were actually riding our mountain bikes through a national park in Australia at the time, having a conversation about, so is it too late, right? What would too late look like? And heaven forbid for all of you, what would we do if we were in charge of the world? And so we spent the next year working on this. We looked at other examples historically. We had some people at MIT doing a model of emissions reduction and how we'd respond, and we looked at the science and said, so what would the scientists say? If we were Churchill saying what is necessary, right, what would the scientists say was necessary? Not what are they saying is our best, what do they think we can do, but what do they say is the right thing to do to have a safe climate for humanity, right, to recognise that keeping society kind of vaguely stable and civilisation moving forward is actually the task at hand here. What would that look like? And the conclusion was very clear. It was 1 degree of warming, right, so pretty much where we are now. Not going higher than that. 350 ppm in terms of CO2e emissions, for those who follow that, was kind of what the scientists are saying today is what we need to get to be, to have a relatively stable climate going forward. It's still ugly. As you may have noticed, there's been a few things happening in the climate recently, so it's not pleasant. Things melt, sea level rises, but it's manageable, right, in terms of where we're going compared to where we're going otherwise. So that's what the scientists would say. That is the absolute minimum necessary to prevent climate change becoming a civilization-threatening issue. And, think about that kind of concept, because we're not having that conversation yet. What we're currently having a conversation about is what is the best that we think we can do, and the politics says that 450 ppm is the best we can do in terms of emissions reduction. And no one thinks we're going to get there, by the way, but that's what government says. China, India, America, everyone agrees that's the right target, which will give us, by the way, 450 ppm, a 50-50 chance of not going past 2 degrees. Right, and the scientists are all saying going past 2 degrees is the point where it might get into a runaway climate change and we might see the collapse of the system and the collapse of civilisation. Now, personally, I think 50-50 is really bad odds for the collapse of civilisation. Right? I'm not going there. That is not what I think is intelligent policy. Right? So, and no scientists are saying it is either, by the way. They're simply saying what would be a reasonable outcome. So that's a very politicised kind of target, even though we're not actually going for it anyway. So that idea, I think, is fundamentally wrong. So Jürgen and I concluded that 1 degree was the right sort of target, and that will change over time, might go lower than that, but it's fundamentally in the right ballpark. Could we do that? And so we spent a year, as I said, looking into that and studying how much would it take, how would you do it, now not in a sort of theoretical sense, but in a practical sense. How many coal-fired power stations would you need to close down? How much would you need to reduce air travel by? How much would you need to stop deforestation? What would it look like in terms of boosting the solar industry, etc., etc.? And our conclusion on all that was that not only was it possible, right, by the way, what you need to do to make it possible, you need to cut CO2 emissions by 50% in 5 years, because we assumed it wasn't going to happen for a while because we noticed that we weren't in charge of the world at that point, and not likely to be anytime soon. But when someone was who wanted to know what the answer was and they went to our plan, we thought 2018, thereabouts, was a reasonable guess in terms of time frame. Not a precise prediction, but we had to have a number to put into this computer model in terms of the forecast. And so we picked 2018. And the answer was that by then we could cut CO2 emissions in half in 5 years, right? And we could eliminate them completely 15 years after that. So we could go to a zero greenhouse gas emitting economy inside 20 years. And from there on, we would need to go negative 6 gigatons a year for the rest of the century. And we could do that, and we'd explain how you would do that. So the point of that is not to sort of have the detailed plan, because it was two blokes working on it. Yes, a lot of work, but it wasn't like it was a complex global climate and computer and economic model. But it was a reasonable guess because Jürgen's been doing this for a long time and we know what it looks like. And the answer was it's doable. Now, it's not cheap, right, and it's not convenient, right, and it does require quite dramatic intervention in the economy, which is why we called it the 1 degree war plan, because it does require us to actually intervene quite heavily, but doing things, by the way, that are infinitely easier than what we did in World War II in the US and Europe, right? Much, much easier. And by the way, much cheaper. You know, Jürgen's best estimate is that it would cost about 10% of GDP. And you compare that to, for example, you know, the cost of World War II in the US being 37% of GDP, right, by the 5th year of the war. So incredible ramp up from 1.6% to 37% of GDP while GDP was growing in 5 years. So again, have no doubt that we can do that. So it's cheap, it's doable, it gets the job done, right? The only thing missing is a decision to act. Now, when I say cheap, let me be clear, it's cheap compared to the alternative, which is the collapse of civilization, which we didn't model precisely, but we understand it's very, very expensive. And so we kind of forget that's the choice, right? That is the choice. It's not a choice between, you know, because we're currently having a choice, well, we're hurtling towards the cliff of climate change and catastrophic impact and collapse, but we'd like to keep energy prices down more than fix that. That's a completely irrational conversation. And we are, in the end, rational people. We have bad days. We're having quite a few of them at the moment. But, you know, we do have bad days and then we get over it and we tend to respond. Now, if you were Churchill before World War II, you would have thought it's impossible. They're all stupid. I know what's going on. They're not listening to me. The evidence is overwhelming. Why are they in denial? They will never respond. We're finished. Right? And then suddenly it changed. So again, it's very important to recognise that our potential for sudden and dramatic change is absolutely ingrained in our history, in our personal behaviour, and when we get there, we're more than capable of it. So the problem, though, that having fixed climate change, transformed the global economy, reinvented transport, infrastructure, completely changed the way we do forestry, etc., which is a good thing to have achieved by then, is that we're still going to suffer the delusion that we can have infinite growth on a finite planet, right? Because we're going to think that, okay, we've got masters of the universe. We went to the brink of the cliff, we came back, we transformed the energy system, we kept the world vaguely stable during that period, we made decisions, we focused the economy, we borrowed our great-grandchildren's credit cards to fix it, and we've done that now, sorry kids. And aren't we wonderful? And then we'll go back to work growing the economy. Now the trouble is with that is that you can't do that, right? Because the issue is actually not climate change. Climate change is a symptom of the fundamental idea that we can grow an economy infinitely on a finite planet, and we can't. Now let me give you some numbers to sort of back that up. So, for example, we would all agree that you know, poverty is very bad, right? And people who are in extreme poverty in particular should be allowed to develop. They have the right to develop. Don't you love that, how all these right-wing think tanks now say people who are poor have the right to develop and we shouldn't deny it to them, as if they ever gave a rat's about poverty previously, right? But now it suits their argument, so suddenly they care a lot about poverty. So, but it's true that we are not able to and have no right to deny people who are in poverty to develop and not be in poverty. That is a basic human right. Now, the idea we've had to fix that is the idea that this pie, right, gets bigger and bigger, and we get richer and richer, and they get slightly less poor, and therefore and it's been working, by the way. There are hundreds of millions of people in China and India who used to be in extreme poverty who are no longer in extreme poverty. We've got ridiculously much richer in the process, and I'll come back to whether that's a good idea or not, but the point is that's the only model we've got for solving it. So it's not a question of the right of them to do it. It's a question of the earth is this big, it is full, right, and to make the economy bigger and bigger to achieve that is not possible. It's not that I don't want to do it, it's not that it doesn't work, although it doesn't work for a bunch of other reasons we'll come back to, but the point is it's not possible. So the idea we have to solve that, right, is not going to happen. And it's not actually working anyway, is the truth. And if you think about this number, for example, for every $100 of economic growth, right, between, I think it was 1995 and 2005, in that period around then, the numbers were that for every $100 of economic growth, 40 cents went to those in extreme poverty. 40 cents. We got $99.60, those of us who actually aren't starving, right? And we gave 40 cents to leftovers to them. Now, of course, that means that this whole model doesn't work anyway. But even if it did work, right, on a sustainable basis, the Earth's full, it can't work going forward, and that means we have a fundamental problem with that idea. If you want some more examples of that, think about, even if you think we can do efficiency and we can make things better and we can still have growth and so on, we would all agree that the poor shouldn't be poor. They should be up to our standard of living, which we'd all agree is because everyone thinks that their standard is the right standard. So let's just use the European standard of living as being the baseline. Let's get everyone in the world up to that level. Let's grow the economy 2% per year going to 2050. 2% would be a very moderate growth rate in that process. Right, so assume we all get 2% higher in that time frame. We're all the same, 2050. The economy would be, by 2050, 15 times its current size. Right, 15 times its current size. There is no level of efficiency you can do, right, in a materially based quantitative economy that achieves an economy 15 times this size. It's just not going to happen. And of course, it doesn't stop in 2050. It will then go on to 2100, and then it would be 80 times this size. So idea number one, infinite growth, finite planet, is not going to happen. And then we have to change that. Now that, I said we'd sort of gone to the bottom here and we weren't going back down again. I actually lied a little bit. We are going somewhere which is, for many people, is much worse than, climate change, loss of biodiversity, death of all the polar bears. This is one of the chapters in the book, and it's called The End of Shopping. So the issue for that, and I'm obviously using shopping as a kind of example of how this all translates, partly joking and sort of playing with people's, thinking, but also genuinely, the whole global economy results in shopping, fundamentally, right? We all, in the end, comes down to us going shopping. There's a great Australian writer in this area, Clive Hamilton, who described the basic idea behind the global economy being to buy things we don't need with money we haven't got to impress people we don't like. Right? So, is the end of shopping actually that big a crisis? Because believe me, if the Earth is full, we're going to have to stop doing it, right? Because there's not enough room. And we can argue about how that happens and how it translates literally into not having enough resources to go and buy stuff. But in the end, if it's a question of physics, you can't overcome that. So somehow or other, we're going to stop shopping. So is that as big a crisis as some would argue? Is it the end of life as we know it? Is it a bad thing? And then we get into, well, how's it working anyway? Is it actually working for us as a model? Are we actually progressing as a society? Are we really doing better as a result? And the answer is no, actually. The answer is that shopping, this is where it gets even more tragic, shopping doesn't make you happy. It's not just, as some people tell me, I don't know where to shop. It actually is proven in the social sciences that shopping doesn't make you happy. Right? What we know is that since the 60s, right, virtually, and it obviously varies a bit by country, but fundamentally, quality of life in the developed world hasn't improved on average in terms of life satisfaction and happiness levels, right, since the 60s, despite incredible increases, right, in economic wealth, despite extraordinary increases in physical standard of living in terms of stuff, right, our lives aren't any better. So why do we do that? Well, what's that about, that we keep on getting caught up in this process? And the answer, of course, is that there is something deep in us that wants more stuff, because for hundreds of thousands of years we haven't had enough stuff, right? Because when we were in serious poverty, we didn't have enough stuff. We were hungry a lot, right? We didn't have enough clothing. We were cold, we were hot, we were uncomfortable, we were in danger. A lot of things went wrong for a very long time. So our genes are deeply trained to worry about that stuff. And so we have this hoarding kind of mentality. And that was a completely rational, very sensible and good thing to do for a long time in the developed world. It's still a good thing to do in many parts of the developing world to make those basic needs get met. But it stops working at a certain point. So what does work? And what does life look like after the end of shopping? So what we know from the study of the social sciences around the world in terms of what the best research is saying is that what makes us happy, what gives, I don't mean distracted or entertained, I mean what gives us a sense of our lives being good. When do we feel good about our lives, and when do we feel good about our kids' future and what life looks like? And the answer is it's things like being connected. Right, this, by the way, is not a philosophy talk. This is actually what the science is saying about what actually works in different countries and as a universal response globally. Being connected, right, makes our quality of life significantly better. Being part of a community, knowing where we belong, having relationships that protect us and support us when things go bad, feeling as though we're part of something, right, is very important. Learning new things, so expanding our brains, learning new skills, being challenged, right, all those things make us a lot happier. Being physically active, right, these, by the way, are the 5 ways of well-being, research done for the UK Office of Science by the in the UK. And so by being physically active, right, getting out in the community, walking, cycling, going to the park, just being engaged, taking notice. So I call that smell the roses, taking the time in your life to notice the joy and wonder around you and just appreciate, the life that we have. And doing that as a conscious, deliberate act of appreciation and gratitude is actually a very powerful source of increased happiness and life satisfaction. And the 5th one is giving, right? So actually doing something meaningful, contributing to the world around you. I don't mean just giving away money. I mean being engaged with your society in a way that actually leaves behind something better, right? And this is really interesting work done by lots of psychologists, is how people who are depressed actually feel better if they get involved in giving to other people, right? So it's very clear that that works. Now, the importance of all that, of course, is that none of those things are available in Walmart, right? You actually can't buy those things. You have to spend time doing them. So what we've been doing is not having time to do them because we've been trying to buy things, right, that we thought would make us happy, and it didn't work. It does work for a few days, and this is, by the way, universal. This is not like targeted at excessively consumerist people or whatever. We all have issues. Mine's hardware shops. I go into a hardware shop and buy tools, and I walk out a better handyman before I get home. It's just incredible. My wife thinks that it isn't actually true, but makes me feel like that for several days afterwards, which is great. It doesn't work, right? So we all do that, and we all have our kind of thing that makes that work for us. But we go and buy it, we get it home, we feel good for a few days. A few days later, it's all worn off. We see an advertisement explaining that the reason we're not happy is because we didn't buy the right one, right? And there's now a new model, and if we had a white one, it would have been so much better. And so we wait for it to die, and we go and they always die pretty quickly. We go and buy a new one, and it's much better because it's a Model 47 and, iPhone 76, whatever they're up to, and then, we feel better, and that doesn't work either, right? So we have to go and buy the next one, and of course to do that we have to work harder because we have so much debt having bought that one. We have to go and spend more time working. So in this unequal, ineffective society, we're working longer hours, right, with more debt, right, to buy more stuff that doesn't work, and so the cycle continues. So, of course, we haven't got time to do the things that actually work. And so because we're full of anxiety about our lives not being good, we go and buy more stuff to make ourselves feel better, and so the cycle continues. So yes, it's advertising and marketing and all those things make it work, but fundamentally it's in us, right? It's fundamentally driven by us, and we're the only ones who can change that. So the good news in that is that, even though this model is broken and people say, I can't imagine that changing, you don't have to imagine it changing. It won't be voluntary. It's going to be compulsory, right? We're going to actually not be able to do it, right? And then, of course, being clever humans, will adapt and say, we didn't like it anyway, actually, right? And we'll have this new culture come through saying, that was yesterday. It's like I go to South Africa a lot, doing talks and working with people there, and, you can't find any white person who supported apartheid anymore. Right? They didn't all leave the country, right? It's just become a different way of thinking, right? And of course it's better, and of course, we always wanted it to be this way. And that's what we do. It's a good quality. So we will adapt to the new world and suddenly say, I actually always wanted it to be this way, right? And so, but the challenge for us now is to move forward and to invent what that new world looks like. So let me close and just summarise what I'm saying. So first of all, in denial, we are in a crisis today. Right, the world is getting very messy, right? We're going to keep doing that for a while longer. We're going to face the crisis. We're going to respond to it eventually, but not yet, right? Because the denial will get stronger, right? More extreme, and then we'll respond. And when we do respond, we will do extraordinary things. And the good news about having spent 50 years working on this and not doing anything is that we've planned the response really, really well. Right, we know everything we need to do. There is nothing we need to invent to fix any of this. There's nothing we need to know. Right, we have all the knowledge about happiness and how to run a good society. We have all the knowledge about technology. We know how to do zero CO2 energy. We know everything we need to do. New technology that will be developed will be better and faster, and that will be nice, but we don't need any of it to act. So there is no solution coming, just the decision to act. And once we do act, we'll fix climate change, and it will be messy, and there will be consequences, and it's going to be ugly, but like a war, we will get through that process and move on, and then we'll realise that we have to do more than that and deconstruct consumer society and invent a new model, and so we'll do that, and then we'll realise we're better off anyway. So that's sort of where we're going. Thank you very much for coming. Open to questions.
Thank you very much. Leif Knudsen, what is the role of the U.S. military as they increasingly realize that energy security is homeland security? Will they be able to raise above the fact that their financial security is dependent on capitalism, which is the structure that is destroying the very nation that they are sworn to defend?
So a couple of comments there. One is that, first of all, the military is now deeply engaged in the issue. So there is an incredible amount of research being done by militaries internally and by military-associated think tanks, right, about climate change as a threat multiplier, as they call it. Right? So they're acutely aware that they have got a major problem. Ironically, they're also major investors in renewables, because you think about, going to Iraq and having to, take huge fuel tankers to an unstable place. They're very focused on the inherent inefficiency, right, in the current model. So they're also major investors in renewables, which is kind of ironic given what they're there for. But the point about this, I think, is to recognise there is going to be a very significant period in human history when things get tight and things get difficult, right? And when that happens, the military gets involved, right? And there is going to be a lot of intervention, in my opinion, around these issues, because, when we have famines, when food supply gets tight, when climate change causes major geographical power shifts, then people will move, right, in very large quantities. That makes countries unstable, that makes regions unstable, and therefore the military does get involved in that process. I don't think the military is going to be the source of questioning capitalism, no. I think that what's going to happen is that the government is going to shift on this issue. I personally don't believe that capitalism as such is, depending on how we define it, is the cause of the problem. Right? I'm actually have been for a long time a big fan of markets as I define them, right, as an effective way of driving change. When I say markets, I don't mean the guys in the New York Cowboys who caused the 2008 credit crisis. I mean the idea of entrepreneurship, the idea of markets being an effective way of driving change once we decide what we need to achieve. So I do believe in some form of market-driven change in this area, but there's going to have to be a very strong government intervention. Think about World War II again. Markets delivered much of the outcome that we needed there in an industrial sense, right? But they were directed to act by government, and that's where I think we're going to go in this area. But that's a big question in terms of us questioning what the model is like. And there is another great quote from my friend Churchill. For those who despair about the US's response on this issue, he had the answer, so you can just feel good about this. He said, America can always be relied upon to do the right thing after it's exhausted all other possibilities.
I am reading your book. I'm on page 192.
Okay, you're into the good stuff.
Yeah, it's a good read. So I am a person who helps coordinate a local group called Scallops. Mm-hmm. It's sustainable communities all over Puget Sound. There are 64 of us. And it's a mix of transition initiatives and eco-villages and local communities kind of developing resilience to climate change. And one of the things that I noticed in your book, in your planning, and kind of the recipes that you give to government and to corporations is that you don't talk a whole lot about local, I mean, it's kind of a presumption. You don't talk about local community development, about dense, walkable urban neighborhoods, about the kind of things, the kind of communities that we're really going to need to face these kinds of future scenarios that you're bringing up. While we all kind of know that that's what we need to do, if you don't have it in a prescription in your book, I know the people in government and in corporations that read this look at this as a recipe book, and they don't see it. So I'm just encouraging you when you get.
Okay. No, great. So let me make a few comments about that, because I think it sort of is in the book implied, so it's not very strong. And you know, the more I think about the issue, the more right I think you are in terms of the likely response. And where it comes to is one of resilience. So people often ask, well, if this is right about where we're going, how do we respond as individuals, as communities, as society? And the answer, to the fundamental answer, the central idea is about resilience. If you're going into difficult times, then the more resilient we are in terms of psychological preparedness for what's coming, but also physical preparedness in terms of community, personally having lower debt, you know, et cetera, is all very much part of that process. And I think there is incredible stuff happening at the community level, when all over the world. Transition Towns movement, I think, coming out of the UK, now spread across the world, is, you know, an extraordinary example of many local communities, as you're referring there, you know, to kind of come up and say, how do we make our world safer? How do we make our world better? Not just a sort of a negative view, things will get ugly, are we ready? But actually, how do we improve quality of life now? And how do we do that from a community basis? So I think it's a very, very important area. And I think one that we'll see a whole lot more action on in the coming years as well, as a natural kind of response. Yeah.
One of the things that distresses me immensely, and I hear it also in your kind of very broad brush, is a lack of acknowledging that we will be the ones to suffer last.
Mm-hmm.
That everyone will, who has, in the third world, and animals especially, will be the ones who, because we have, for the most part, in my mind, indulgently avoided dealing with much of this, we will also manage to be safe in our little ark longer than anyone else. And I wonder if you could sort of address the ethics of that, because I think we will be morally bankrupt if we don't open up before it hits our shores and makes us suffer, so to speak.
Yeah, no, great, thank you. And a major part of the book towards the end about poverty and inequality and what that looks like, so it's a very, very important issue and one we're going to have to face for these reasons. So we live now in a relatively globalised society, right, in a globalised economy. So it's actually very hard to separate ourselves off from the poor from the rich. Right, and even though we think we do, and even though we had this sense of sort of this enclave of wealth in the face of poverty, the reality is, I think, going into what we're going into, which is not isolated examples of problems, but a fundamental systemic threat to the system, that we are going to suffer very greatly, right, in the rich world directly as a result. Right, so I think it's important to recognise that what we're going into is going to be messy, but is not going to be isolated. Right, and then I think we're going to have this mentality because we've managed to pull it off so far, and I'll come back to the ethical dilemma of this in a moment, but in a practical sense, you know, think about, you know, I think about this in terms of extreme weather. Right, where would you rather be in a extreme weather event, you know, the hill tribes of Thailand or New Orleans? Right, and I kind of think when it's a one-off thing, you can see how being in a Western country is better because they do eventually arrive to provide services, but when it's happening at a massive scale, I'm not so sure. Right, when facing global economic calamity, the developing world, yes, will suffer in some senses more, but it's more complicated than that, I think, because there's also a sense where they're more resilient. They're naturally more resilient because they're not used to having a service society, which we have. Right, so this is the sort of the breakdown argument of society. I mean, a great report done by the New Economics Foundation in the UK called 96 Hours to Anarchy. And it was an argument about how dependent we are on just-in-time food deliveries and how nobody has food resilience in their lives or their countries anymore. And the example was if we withdrew the oil supply, there was a big strike and picket action against the fuel depots, right, for truck drivers in the UK, and there's only a small number of them. And so it made the government think about what would happen if we actually lost the centralised fuel supply for the deliveries of food. And the 96 Hours to Anarchy, the answer was 4 days, all the supermarket shelves are empty. Right? Now, you be in a city like Seattle, London, New York, any major city, and imagine the food supply being gone in 4 days, right? And you have got a very, very unstable society. So I'm not saying that's going to happen. What I'm saying is we kind of have this, I think, incorrect belief in how stable our society is. And we've knocked out every inefficiency, so-called, in the system, and as a result made us tightly wound in which case the shocks, I think, are much greater, right? So I think it's going to be more complicated than that. I'm not moving to the hill tribes of Thailand yet, but I think it's definitely an interesting kind of argument. So the other thing is the ethical issue, right, which you also raised. I go through this in some detail in the book, and I think there's sort of two parts of this. One is about the ethics of destroying the physical environment in terms of biodiversity, the loss of life, and so on. And this I think, is a really interesting psychological kind of complex issue, is that I think we in many ways have to go through a grieving process for where we are, right? So a lot of people in the environmental movement community pushed back on my argument in the early days, 2005 and so on the grounds that it's not that bad, right? We will respond. We can't accept failure, right? And by the way, it's a really bad strategy because we can't acknowledge that anyway, even if it was true, because we'll disempower people. So that's been the kind of mantra in the environmental movement for a long time. Don't be doom and gloom, be positive, it'll all be okay. I think it's wrong. I mean, it may have been right 20 years ago, but it's wrong now because we're now in denial about how bad it is. So there is a sense where I think we have to face up to the sense of loss. There is a grieving process that goes on there. I was actually, funny story, not at the time, but I was presenting on this in 2007 or 8 to a business audience in New York about the loss of biodiversity and the crisis that was coming, and I started crying, which is a really bad look for a big Aussie bloke in front of a business audience in particular. And I realised, I thought, whoa, where did that come from? Now, it was completely by surprise. I wasn't telling, I didn't think, a very sad story. It was just talking about the failure of environmentalism and the collapse of many things that we held dear, which is arguably in hindsight pretty obviously sad. But I didn't feel sad, but boy, I suddenly was sad. And I went home and telling my wife about this sort of rather embarrassing outbreak of tears in New York in a cafe in Sydney, and we both started crying. And what was happening was I was going through the grieving process of the pain and suffering that I think we have let loose on the world, both to people, which is your point, but also to the natural environment, with incredible arrogance. And I think we kind of have to acknowledge that. And we have to kind of not be in denial about that, but we mustn't, so we kind of have to go through a grieving process but not stay there. But we have to acknowledge how bad it is and how bad it's going to be and the completely unethical nature, as you say, of the consequences of that. And then we have to go, okay, now it's time to go back to work. Because if we stay in that place, in anger and denial and blame, we won't fix the problem, right? And whatever happens, there is a future we need to get ready for. And that process, I think, is actually a very important one. So thanks for the question.